The city lights of New York flickered through the tall windows of Alexander Wade's office, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out and echo the loneliness within him. Known for his tenacity in the courtroom and his relentless dedication to social causes, Alexander Wade was the attorney that everyone wanted on their side. Yet few dared approach him personally. Friends, family. It was all in the past, buried beneath years of walls he'd meticulously constructed. Alexander sat alone at his desk, surrounded by files, affidavits, and half-drunk cups of coffee. Tonight, like every other night, work was his only companion. A photograph of a boy with dark hair and a crooked smile rested near his keyboard. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the image for a moment before pulling back, as if even the memory of touch could reopen old wounds. 5 years had passed since that night, the night he'd lost his son. The details haunted him in flashes. The screeching tires, the crunch of metal, the hospital room where he sat waiting for news that never came. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wade," the doctor had said, voice blurred in his memory, but the pain was sharp, vivid. His wife had left soon after. Their grief was too heavy, fracturing the love they'd once shared. Since then, Alexander poured himself into his cases, crusading for justice, taking on clients who couldn't afford him, hoping, perhaps, to atone for something he couldn't quite name. Tonight, a strange quiet settled over the office. Outside, snow began to fall in thick, slow flakes. New York in winter was unforgiving, and the streets, usually roaring with life, lay muted under the blanket of snow. Just as Alexander was preparing to leave, a faint knocking reached his ears. He ignored it at first, assuming it was an echo from the hallway. But then, the knock came again, louder and more insistent. Alexander frowned, approaching the door and swinging it open, only to find himself staring down at a small, thin figure. A young girl, no more than 8 or 9, stood in the hallway, shivering in a thin coat, her hands clenched together. "Are you Mr. Wade?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alexander's surprise turned to wariness. "Yes, that's me. What are you doing here?" He glanced around, expecting to see a parent or guardian, but the hallway was empty. The girl looked down at her shoes, struggling to hold back tears. My mom. She's sick. I didn't know where else to go." His first instinct was to tell her he couldn't help, that she should call the police or an ambulance. But something in her voice, in the desperation that echoed his own pain, stopped him. For the first time in years, he felt a faint stir of something beyond his carefully constructed walls. Compassion. It was unfamiliar, foreign, yet undeniable. "All right," he said after a pause, his tone gentler. "Come inside, and tell me more about what's going on." As the girl stepped into his office, her eyes scanning the stacks of paperwork, he saw how thin she was, her cheeks hollow, her eyes dark with worry. She took a deep breath, looking up at him with a determination that caught him off guard. "My mom, she needs help. We don't have any money, and I don't know what to do." Alexander knelt down, trying to meet the girl's eyes, but she kept them fixed on the floor, as if ashamed to even be there. He hadn't been this close to a child in years. The air in the room felt heavier, the silence thicker. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "What's your name?" "Ellie," she whispered, almost as if the name might shatter something. He nodded, waiting. "And where is your mother now, Ellie?" "She's at home. She couldn't get up today," Ellie murmured, her voice barely audible. She looked up, her eyes flashing with a spark of desperation. I tried calling for help, but no one came. And then I remembered seeing your name on the wall by the building. I thought maybe you could." Alexander took a slow breath, aware of how his pulse was quickening. Every instinct in him screamed to keep this distance, to point her to someone else, anyone else. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was seeing someone he once knew, someone he'd lost. "All right," he said, standing up and grabbing his coat from the back of the chair. "Let's go to your mother." Ellie's face lit up in surprise, and she nodded quickly, as if afraid he might change his mind. They walked side by side through the office lobby, past rows of darkened cubicles and out into the snowy night. Alexander noticed her shoes were soaked through, leaving faint, wet footprints on the marble floors. As they stepped outside, he instinctively took off his scarf and wrapped it around her neck. Ellie flinched at first and used to the kindness, then hugged the scarf closer. They walked in silence, the sound of traffic muffled under the thickening snow. Alexander kept an eye on Ellie, her small figure dwarfed by the city lights, her breath puffing out in small clouds as they trudged along. Eventually, they reached a rundown building on the edge of the east side, its walls peeling and covered in graffiti. The entrance door creaked as they entered, and Alexander felt a surge of unease as he took in the dimly lit hallway, the flickering light bulb overhead. "Here," Ellie said, leading him up 2 flights of rickety stairs to a narrow door with chipped paint and a tarnished handle. She pulled out a small, rusty key from her coat pocket, struggling to turn it in the lock. After a moment, the door gave way, and Alexander stepped inside, the musty smell of dampness hitting him immediately. In the dim light, he could see a woman lying on a thin mattress in the corner of the cramped room. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of her chest a visible struggle. She stirred as they approached, her eyes fluttering open, squinting to make out the figures entering her space. "Mom!" Ellie's voice was soft, filled with relief. She knelt beside the woman, touching her forehead with a tenderness that spoke of familiarity with this routine, with this worry. The woman's eyes focused on Alexander, a look of confusion crossing her face. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice strained and raspy. "My name's Alexander Wade," he replied, keeping his tone low and calm. "Your daughter found me. She was worried about you." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she looked from him to Ellie. She tried to sit up but sank back, the effort seeming too much. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where else she could go." "It's all right," Alexander said, looking around the room and taking in the bare walls, the single chair by the window, the pile of blankets stacked in the corner. He could see now that Ellie had been trying to keep the place together on her own, as best as a child could, but it was clear they needed help, more than he knew how to give. "Have you seen a doctor?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. The woman shook her head weakly, her eyes closing as if even the question was a weight. "No insurance. Nothing to pay with." She paused, catching her breath, before looking at him again, a trace of pride still present despite her obvious weakness. "I'll be fine." Alexander's gaze shifted to Ellie, who was watching her mother with a fierce, quiet determination. She looked so small, yet there was a strength in her that was hard to ignore, a resilience that reminded him of someone long gone. "I can help you," he said, almost surprising himself. He hadn't planned to say it, but now that he had, the resolve settled in his chest. He would take her to a clinic, cover whatever cost came up. It was a promise he made to himself, but the woman's expression turned wary. "We don't take charity," she said, her voice firm despite her weakened state. "I've done enough to make sure Ellie knows we take care of ourselves. I don't want her thinking," she broke off, her words trailing into silence. Alexander nodded, respecting her dignity but firm in his own stance. "It's not charity," he replied quietly. "Think of it as someone who owes a favor, one I intend to pay forward. Besides, Ellie here. She came all the way to my office. I'd say that deserves a bit of help." The woman looked at her daughter, her eyes softening. "Is that true, Ellie? You went alone?" Ellie nodded, her chin tilting up with a small spark of defiance. "Yes, Mom. I had to do something." Alexander watched as the mother's expression melted, the fight in her eyes fading as she looked at her daughter. A deep, weary sigh escaped her, and she nodded, the weight of her pride too heavy to hold any longer. "All right," she whispered, her voice filled with exhaustion. Alexander stepped forward, glancing at Ellie. "We'll get her somewhere safe and warm for the night, somewhere she can rest," he assured her. For the first time, Ellie's face broke into a tentative smile, as if hope was something she'd nearly forgotten. As he guided them out, Alexander felt a strange sense of clarity. This was temporary, he told himself. Just one night of help. But deep down, he sensed something shifting, something he couldn't yet explain. The next morning, Alexander waited outside the clinic, leaning against the hood of his car as he watched people shuffle past in the early light. His mind drifted back to Ellie and her mother, picturing them in that small, dim apartment. It was an image he couldn't shake. Ellie's quiet strength, her mother's frail voice asking him for no favors. The clinic doors opened, and he saw Ellie guiding her mother out, one hand gripping a small bottle of medicine they'd been prescribed, the other holding tightly to her mother's arm. He could see the weariness etched across the woman's face, the sort of fatigue that went beyond lack of sleep. Still, she gave him a brief nod, a trace of pride lingering in her eyes. "Thank you for arranging this," she said softly, her voice as steady as she could manage. Alexander nodded, keeping his tone casual. "It's the least I could do. The doctor said you need to rest, and the medication should help with the pain. You should come back for a follow-up in a week." She hesitated, her gaze shifting to Ellie. "We'll manage, somehow." A silence settled between them, the weight of words unspoken. Alexander knew they needed more than what he could give in a single morning. He felt torn, knowing he couldn't walk away now, but uncertain of how to help without crossing lines they seemed intent on keeping. "You know," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I have a guest room at my place. It's not much, but it's warm. You wouldn't have to worry about bills or medicine, just until you're back on your feet." Ellie's mother stiffened, her expression unreadable. She glanced at her daughter, then back at him. "We've always been on our own," she said, her voice tight with the same pride she'd shown in the apartment. "I don't want Ellie thinking we can just rely on strangers." Alexander nodded, not wanting to push. But he also saw the way Ellie's eyes darted to her mother, filled with a mixture of worry and a hint of hope. "Think of it as temporary," he replied. "Just a few days. I'm a busy man. I'm hardly ever home. You'd have your own space, and it'd give you a chance to recover without worrying about rent or heat." Ellie's mother bit her lip, casting another glance at her daughter, who was now looking down at her feet, as if trying to hide her relief. Slowly, she nodded, almost to herself. "Just a few days," she murmured, finally meeting his eyes. He drove them to his townhouse on the Upper West Side, the silence in the car filled with unspoken questions. He'd never had guests before. The house was neat, meticulously organized, but it lacked any warmth. The thought of anyone else occupying the space was foreign, but seeing Ellie and her mother in the rearview mirror, he knew he'd made the right choice. When they arrived, he showed them to the guest room on the second floor, the largest room in the house aside from his own. It was a simple space, with a bed, a small dresser, and a desk by the window that looked out onto a quiet street below. Ellie's mother looked around, visibly moved by the modest comfort it offered. "This is more than enough," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Ellie's face lit up as she dropped her small bag on the floor and ran her fingers over the bedspread, her eyes wide. "It's soft, Mom," she said, smiling for the first time since he'd met her. The sight surprised him, and he realized how rare a moment of genuine joy was for her. Alexander cleared his throat. "You can stay as long as you need," he said, glancing away to avoid her mother's gaze. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Ellie's mother looked at him, her expression softening just a little. "I don't know how to thank you," she murmured, her voice quiet. "You don't have to," he replied, feeling a strange sense of peace. "Just rest." As he turned to leave, Ellie tugged at his sleeve, looking up at him with something close to wonder. "Thank you, Mr. Wade." "Really?" He managed a small smile, the words catching in his throat. "You're welcome, Ellie." Days passed, and Alexander grew accustomed to the quiet presence of Ellie and her mother in his home. He would leave early, returning late in the evening, but there was always a faint sense of warmth when he entered the house, a feeling that had been missing for too long. He often found Ellie in the kitchen, helping her mother with small tasks, her laughter sometimes echoing softly down the hall. One evening, as Alexander entered the house after a long day in court, he found Ellie sitting on the stairs, waiting for him. She looked up as he approached, her expression uncertain. "Mr. Wade, I was wondering, do you like books?" she asked, her voice tentative. He blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Books?" he repeated, trying to recall the last time he'd read anything that wasn't a legal document. She nodded, her face lighting up. I found a big one in your library, she explained, looking almost shy. It has lots of stories, and I thought maybe we could read one together? For a moment, Alexander hesitated, but seeing the eager light in her eyes, he felt his resistance fade. All right, he said, surprising even himself. Which story do you want to read? Ellie's eyes sparkled with excitement as she led him to the library, a room he rarely used. She picked out a thick, dusty book from the shelf and handed it to him. This one, she said with a grin. They settled into the large leather armchair by the window, Ellie sitting cross-legged on the floor, listening intently as he read the first page aloud. Her eyes were wide, absorbing every word, and Alexander found himself engrossed in the story, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. He'd forgotten the simple pleasure of storytelling, of sharing a moment without the weight of expectation or loss. As he read, a soft voice interrupted him. "Why don't you have any family, Mr. Wade?" Ellie asked, her tone innocent but piercing. He froze, the question hanging heavy in the air. Ellie looked up at him, her face filled with genuine curiosity, and he felt his chest tighten. For a moment, he considered brushing it off, but there was something about her gaze that made him want to answer truthfully. "I did," he replied slowly, his voice quiet. "Once. But things changed." Ellie tilted her head, waiting, and he found himself compelled to continue. "I lost my son," he said, the words coming out softer than he intended. "And his mother and I went our separate ways after that." Ellie's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing her small hand on his arm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wade," she whispered, her voice filled with sincerity. He looked down at her hand, feeling the warmth seep through him, and he managed a faint smile. "Thank you, Ellie." In that quiet moment, Alexander realized that in the short time since they'd come into his life, Ellie and her mother had begun to fill a space he hadn't even known was empty. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander's townhouse took on a warmth it hadn't seen in years. The once silent rooms now held laughter, the faint aroma of home-cooked meals, and the quiet hum of voices as Ellie and her mother settled into his space. Alexander found himself lingering in the living room each evening, where he and Ellie had established a quiet routine of reading together, her mother often listening from a nearby armchair, eyes closed, as if the stories offered her some solace. One chilly evening, as snow began to dust the city streets, Alexander entered the kitchen to find Ellie standing on a small stool, attempting to stir a pot on the stove. She was bundled in one of his sweaters, the sleeves comically large on her small frame. She looked up, startled, but quickly grinned. "I'm making soup," she announced proudly, though her grip on the spoon was a bit unsteady. He raised an eyebrow, suppressing a smile. "Are you, now? Looks like you've got everything under control." Ellie giggled, stirring the pot with extra enthusiasm. Her mother, leaning against the counter with a tired but amused expression, looked on with approval. "Ellie wanted to surprise you," she said softly. Her voice had regained some strength over the past few weeks, though there was still a fragility to her that Alexander couldn't ignore. Alexander joined them at the stove, watching Ellie's determined face as she focused on stirring. "Well, I am surprised," he said. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal in longer than I'd like to admit." "Then you'll love this," Ellie said with a grin, giving the spoon a final swirl before ladling the soup into a bowl. She carefully placed it on the table, gesturing for him to sit. Alexander lowered himself into the chair, surprised by the genuine excitement he felt. The soup was simple, but there was a warmth to it, a feeling of care that he hadn't realized he'd missed. He took a spoonful, nodding in approval. "This is good, Ellie," he said, meeting her proud gaze. "Really good." Ellie beamed, pulling up a chair beside him. She watched him eat, clearly delighted, and he could feel her mother's eyes on him, a grateful, unspoken thanks that passed between them. They ate together, laughter filling the room as Ellie recounted her day. Small stories that held an innocence he found both foreign and comforting. After dinner, as he cleared the table, Ellie lingered beside him, fidgeting with her hands. Finally, she looked up, her expression uncertain. "Mr. Wade, can I ask you something?" He paused, setting a plate down, and turned to face her. "Of course." Her eyes darted away, as if gathering courage. Why do you help people? Like, even when they can't pay you? The question caught him off guard, and he could feel the weight of her mother's gaze from across the room. He considered his answer carefully, aware of how much it mattered to this girl who'd come to look up to him. Sometimes, when you've lost something important, helping others can make that loss a little easier to bear, he replied slowly. It feels like, maybe, in some way, you're making things right for someone else. Ellie nodded, her face thoughtful. She seemed to absorb his answer, her eyes searching his as if seeing him in a new light. I think you help people because you're kind, Mr. Wade, she said quietly. Even if you don't like to say it. Alexander couldn't help but smile, caught off guard by the simplicity of her words. Well, I'm not sure anyone's ever said that to me before, he murmured, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. As the evening wore on, he excused himself to his office to go through a few case files. The familiar rhythm of work gave him some comfort, yet tonight, he found it difficult to concentrate. Thoughts of Ellie and her mother lingered in his mind, the small moments they shared beginning to chip away at the wall he'd built around himself. The idea of going back to an empty life, one devoid of their presence, filled him with an unease he hadn't felt in years. The next day, he woke early, intent on returning a few overdue calls. As he made his way downstairs, he noticed the faint sound of hushed voices coming from the guest room. He stopped by the door, listening as Ellie's mother spoke in a low, shaky tone. I don't want to keep depending on Mr. Wade, Ellie, her mother was saying. He's been generous, but we can't stay here forever. I don't want to burden him, Ellie's voice, clear and determined, replied. But Mom, he likes having us here. I can tell. And I like it too. Alexander felt a pang of guilt, as if he were intruding on something private, yet he couldn't move away. Her mother's voice softened, laced with the faintest hint of regret. You deserve a real home, Ellie. A place of our own. We can't stay in someone else's life forever. Ellie was quiet, and Alexander took a few steps back, retreating to the hallway. The words echoed in his mind, a reminder of his own reservations. Yet, in that moment, he knew he didn't want them to leave. In some way, their presence had brought him back to life, pulled him out of the isolation he'd wrapped around himself. Later that evening, as they gathered for another shared dinner, he decided to broach the topic. As they finished the meal, he cleared his throat, his eyes finding Ellie's mother's gaze. I've been thinking, he began, choosing his words carefully. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. I know you're worried about intruding, but this place hasn't felt like home in a long time. And with you here, it finally does. Ellie's mother looked at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. Mr. Wade, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done, but I don't want us to become a burden to you. He shook his head, his voice firm. You're not a burden. In fact, you've done more for me than you realize. A quiet understanding passed between them, and she nodded, her eyes softening. Ellie beamed, her face filled with relief, and Alexander felt a sense of peace settle over him. The days that followed grew more comfortable, and a quiet routine formed between them. Alexander found himself looking forward to his evenings at home, reading stories with Ellie, sharing quiet conversations with her mother, who had begun to open up, sharing fragments of her past, pieces of the life they'd led before hardship had taken its toll. One evening, as Ellie was getting ready for bed, Alexander noticed a small, round object dangling from a chain around her neck. It glinted under the light, a delicate, silver locket. He felt a strange jolt as he recognized the pattern etched into its surface, a sunburst, almost identical to the one he had given his son all those years ago. Ellie, he said, his voice catching. That locket. Where did you get it? Ellie looked down, surprised. This? I've had it for as long as I can remember. Mom said it was from before. She hesitated, glancing at her mother, who had frozen, her face pale. Alexander turned to her mother, a question in his eyes. Her expression was guarded, her gaze dropping to the floor. Ellie was adopted, she said softly, barely above a whisper. I never knew her real family. The room felt suddenly cold, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Alexander struggled to find his voice, his mind racing. Could it be? The thought seemed impossible, and yet, the locket, so identical to the one he'd gifted his son, lay like an anchor in the pit of his stomach. His heart pounded as he looked at Ellie, at her curious gaze, so innocent, so unaware of the questions that now consumed him. He managed a nod, forcing himself to stay calm. "Ellie," he said slowly, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "That locket. It's very special." The little girl looked down, fingers tracing the pattern. "I've always thought so too," she replied, a small smile playing at her lips. Alexander's heart ached as he watched her. The past had returned, unbidden, and now the questions he'd buried for years were stirring to life. That night, Alexander lay awake, his mind restless as he stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening. Ellie's locket haunted him, its familiar sunburst design etched into his memory as if it were yesterday. He remembered giving that same locket to his son on his 5th birthday, slipping it over his small head and watching it gleam around his neck. Could it be the same one? The thought was absurd, impossible even, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a revelation he hadn't dared to hope for. Unable to find peace, Alexander rose from bed and went to his office, his fingers brushing over old files, forgotten photos, and worn memories that had gathered dust over the years. He pulled out a small photograph from a drawer, the last photo he had of his son, taken just a week before the accident. In it, his son wore the locket, its silver catching the sunlight. He clutched the photograph tightly, his chest heavy with an aching mix of longing and dread. The next morning, he resolved to start looking into Ellie's past, discreetly at first. He didn't want to alarm her mother, who had slowly begun to open up around him, or to plant hopes in Ellie's heart that might never bear fruit. But he had to know. It was as if his life depended on this answer. That afternoon, he made a few calls to contacts in social services, attorneys he trusted to keep the matter private. The process was slow and laden with legal hurdles, as most adoption records were sealed. But the more he searched, the more his instincts whispered that there was something buried in Ellie's past, something that pointed back to him. Days passed, his nights sleepless, his mind plagued by questions that seemed to grow with each dead end. One evening, as he sat by the fire, Ellie's mother joined him, her face drawn and pale, as if she, too, had been carrying a heavy burden. She looked at him, a question flickering in her eyes. "You've been quieter these days," she remarked softly, her gaze steady but concerned. "Is everything all right?" He hesitated, wondering how much to reveal. "There's something I need to ask you," he replied, his voice low, laced with hesitation. "It's about Ellie and her adoption." A shadow crossed her face, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. "What about it?" Alexander met her gaze, his expression earnest, almost pleading. "I know it's a difficult topic, but do you know anything about her biological family? Anything at all?" She looked down, the silence thick and heavy. "I don't know much," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Ellie was a few months old when I adopted her. All I was told was that she'd been abandoned. No one came forward to claim her." His heart sank, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wanted to tell her about the locket, about his son, about the questions clawing at him day and night. But the fear of opening old wounds held him back, the fear that he was chasing a ghost, that he'd only hurt them both. "I see," he said quietly, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "Thank you for telling me." She gave him a long, searching look. "Why do you ask, Mr. Wade?" There was a gentleness in her tone, but also a hint of suspicion, as if she sensed there was something deeper beneath his question. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I just wanted to make sure Ellie has everything she needs," he replied, his voice strained. "I wanted to know if there was anyone from her past that might be important to her." She nodded slowly, accepting his answer, though her eyes lingered on him, as if there were questions in her heart she hadn't voiced. The next day, Alexander's search grew more frantic, his desperation building. He managed to track down the adoption agency that had handled Ellie's case, an old firm operating out of a cramped office on the Lower East Side. It took several calls and a few favors from old friends, but eventually, he was able to secure an appointment with one of the agency's representatives, an older woman named Ruth who had been handling adoptions for decades. The office was dimly lit, files stacked haphazardly around the room, the walls lined with faded photographs of families and children. Ruth greeted him with a weary smile, her eyes sharp despite her age. She gestured for him to sit, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. "You must be Mr. Wade," she said, studying him with a shrewd gaze. "I understand you're asking about a young girl, Ellie?" "Yes," he replied, his voice tense. "I believe she was adopted through this agency about 8 years ago. I was hoping you could tell me a little more about her background." Ruth hesitated, glancing at the file she'd pulled out for their meeting. "You understand that most of our records are confidential," she said, her tone cautious. "But in Ellie's case, there's not much to keep confidential, I'm afraid. She was abandoned, left at a fire station downtown. No name, no note, no trace of her family." Alexander felt a pang of despair, his hopes slipping through his fingers like sand. "No identifying information at all?" he pressed, barely keeping the desperation out of his voice. Ruth shook her head, her expression sympathetic. "The only thing she had on her was a locket, a silver one with a sunburst design. We hoped it might lead to someone, but no one ever came forward." His heart stopped, the words hitting him with the force of a tidal wave. "The locket? It was a sunburst?" She nodded, her gaze narrowing as she watched his reaction. "Yes. You seem surprised. Does it mean something to you?" Alexander took a deep breath, steadying himself as his mind raced. It's exactly like when I gave my son," he murmured, the admission slipping out before he could stop it. Ruth's expression softened, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. "I see," she said gently, closing the file. "I can't imagine what you've been through, Mr. Wade. I don't know if this girl is. I mean, it would be extraordinary if she were." He nodded, his mind barely processing her words. It felt as if everything had fallen into place and yet was still out of reach, like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He knew he had to tell Ellie's mother, to reveal the possibility of this truth to her, as painful and uncertain as it might be. That evening, he returned home, his heart pounding as he climbed the stairs to the guest room. Ellie's mother was sitting by the window, reading one of the books he'd lent her, but she looked up as he entered, her expression immediately shifting to concern. "Mr. Wade, is everything all right?" He swallowed, gathering his courage. "There's something I need to tell you. About Ellie." She set the book down, her face paling as she waited for him to continue. "Ellie's locket. It's exactly like one I gave my son years ago," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And I spoke with the adoption agency. They confirmed that the only item Ellie was found with was that locket." Her face drained of color, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. "Are you saying?" He nodded, struggling to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "I think Ellie might be my daughter." The silence was thick, charged with the weight of his words. She looked down, her expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a faint, growing understanding. Finally, she met his gaze, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Oh, my God," she whispered, her voice breaking. All this time, Alexander stepped forward, his own voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how this happened. I don't know why it took so long to find her. But if there's even a chance..." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You have to tell her, Mr. Wade. She deserves to know. To have a father." He felt the impact of her words, the enormity of the truth he was about to reveal. For so long, he'd buried his grief, convinced that he would never feel the joy of being a father again. And now, with Ellie just down the hall, he knew that his life would never be the same. That night, Alexander sat in the quiet of his living room, the fire casting shadows on the walls, as he grappled with what he was about to do. How do you tell a child that everything she thought she knew about her life might be wrong? That the man she'd come to trust wasn't just a friend, but her father? A father who'd never known she was alive until now. The door creaked softly, and he looked up to see Ellie standing there, her face half hidden by the dim light, her eyes curious yet hesitant. "Mr. Wade, you're still up?" she asked, wrapping her arms around herself as if sensing the weight of his thoughts. Alexander managed a faint smile, patting the seat beside him. "I couldn't sleep," he replied, watching as she padded over, her small feet quiet against the floor. She settled beside him, tucking her legs under herself, gazing at him with the innocence and openness that always disarmed him. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he searched for the words. "Ellie, there's something important I need to talk to you about. Something that might be hard to understand." She tilted her head, her eyes wide and attentive, a hint of worry flickering there. "Is it something bad?" "No, not bad," he replied softly. "But it might change things. You remember the locket you showed me?" Ellie's fingers instinctively went to the chain around her neck, touching the small silver pendant. She nodded slowly, looking down at it. "Yeah, it's really special to me." He reached over, his hand gentle as he touched the locket, his voice barely above a whisper. "I gave a locket just like this to my son, a long time ago. He was very important to me." Ellie looked up, her brow furrowed. "You had a son?" "Yes," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "But I lost him a long time ago, and I thought I'd never see him again." The room was silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Ellie stared at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and sympathy, as if she sensed his pain but didn't fully understand it. "But, Mr. Wade," she began slowly, her voice trembling, "what does that have to do with me?" He took a steadying breath, his gaze steady but filled with warmth. "Ellie, I think you might be my daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Ellie blinked, her eyes wide, as if the weight of his statement was too much to comprehend. She looked down at the locket, her fingers tracing its design as if seeing it for the first time. "But how?" she whispered, her voice filled with confusion. "I don't understand. I didn't know." "Ellie," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know you were out there, that you were mine. Somehow, after the accident, you must have been taken to the adoption agency. I've been looking for you all this time, even though I didn't realize it was you." Ellie's eyes filled with tears, her small face crumpling as she tried to process his words. She looked up at him, a mixture of hope and heartbreak in her gaze. "So, you're really my dad?" He nodded, reaching out to gently brush a tear from her cheek. "Yes, Ellie, I believe I am." In a moment that seemed suspended in time, Ellie's expression shifted, the confusion melting away as a fragile smile began to form. She threw her arms around him, clutching him tightly, and he felt her small body tremble as she buried her face against his chest. "Why did it take so long?" she murmured, her voice muffled by his shirt. Alexander wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, the enormity of the moment settling over him like a wave. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice raw, "but I promise I'm here now, and I won't ever let you go." They stayed like that for a long time, his hand gently stroking her hair as he held her close, the walls he'd spent years building slowly beginning to crumble. For the first time, he felt the possibility of something more, something beyond the grief, the loneliness. A chance to be a father again, to have a family, even if it was only him and Ellie. Eventually, Ellie pulled back, wiping her eyes as she looked up at him, her expression softer, yet tinged with questions. Does Mom know?" she asked tentatively, glancing toward the guest room where her adoptive mother slept. "Yes," Alexander said gently. "She knows. And she wants what's best for you, just like I do." Ellie nodded, her gaze shifting to the fire as if lost in thought. After a moment, she looked back at him, a small, shy smile breaking through her tears. "So, does this mean we can be a family?" He felt his heart swell, the question filling him with a hope he hadn't dared to feel in years. "Yes," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. "If that's what you want, Ellie, then yes." Her face lit up, the smile spreading as she leaned against him once more, contentment settling over her like a warm blanket. They sat together, watching the fire until the flames began to fade, the quiet comfort of newfound belonging filling the space between them. But as the days went on, Alexander knew there were still challenges to face. He'd started to dig into the past, trying to piece together how Ellie had been lost to him, and the search was revealing dark shadows, secrets he'd never anticipated. The night he discovered the agency's records showed signs of tampering, his heart sank. The adoption hadn't been as straightforward as he'd initially thought. One evening, after Ellie had gone to bed, Alexander sat with her mother at the dining table, the weight of what he'd uncovered pressing down on him. "There's something wrong with Ellie's adoption records," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. I think there was foul play. Someone wanted her to disappear." Her mother's face went pale, her hand instinctively clutching the edge of the table. "What are you saying, Mr. Wade?" He took a deep breath, his expression darkening. "I think someone might have taken her, made sure she was placed far away from her real family. I don't know why, but it feels intentional. I'm going to find out who did this and why." Her mother looked down, the gravity of his words sinking in. "Ellie deserves to know the truth," she murmured, her voice filled with sadness. "I never imagined. I thought I was giving her a chance at a better life. But now," Alexander placed a reassuring hand on hers, "you gave her love. That's more than anyone else did for her during that time. None of this is your fault." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Wade, for everything. I don't know how to let her go, even if it's the right thing." "You don't have to let her go," he replied firmly. "Ellie will always need you. You're as much a part of her life as I am now." They sat in silence, a shared understanding passing between them. But as Alexander looked toward the stairs where Ellie slept, he knew his journey wasn't over. There were answers he still needed, shadows he still had to chase, and he would go to any lengths to uncover the truth, to finally bring peace to the family he'd found again. Over the next few weeks, Alexander's life took on a new purpose. Each day, he pored over case files, made calls, and followed leads, diving deeper into Ellie's adoption records, determined to find the truth. He worked tirelessly, reviewing every document, every signature, every trace of paperwork that might tell him why his daughter had been lost to him for so many years. The pieces of the puzzle were there, hidden in plain sight, but each one felt deliberately obscured, as if someone had carefully constructed a barrier between him and Ellie. One afternoon, he received a call from Ruth, the adoption agency's elderly clerk who had first handled Ellie's file. Her voice was hesitant, as though what she was about to say held gravity far beyond her comfort. "Mr. Wade," she began, "I've been thinking about what you asked me, and I remembered something that might help. It was years ago, but there was a woman who came in shortly after Ellie's case was processed. She asked strange questions about the children in our care, almost as if she was selecting. She had a way about her that I didn't trust." "What do you mean?" Alexander asked, his heart pounding. "Do you remember her name?" Ruth hesitated, as if reaching deep into the fog of memory. "I don't remember her full name, but I recall she worked with some of the city's foster agencies, often in cases where children were involved in complex situations. Her first name was Maria, I believe." Alexander's grip tightened on the phone. "And you think she might know more about Ellie's adoption?" "Yes," Ruth replied cautiously. "If there was any foul play, she may have had a hand in it. I can give you the last known address we had for her, though it's quite old." After jotting down the address, Alexander thanked Ruth, his mind racing with possibilities. This lead was the closest he'd come to an answer, but he knew approaching it would take care. He couldn't risk alarming anyone, not with Ellie's well-being at stake. The next evening, Alexander found himself standing outside an old brick building in Brooklyn, the address Ruth had given him. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and faded paint. He took a steadying breath before knocking on the door. After a moment, the door creaked open and a woman appeared, her graying hair pulled into a tight bun, her sharp eyes narrowing as she looked him over. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. "Yes, I'm looking for Maria. I was told she might live here." She crossed her arms, studying him. "Depends on who's asking. My name is Alexander Wade. I'm trying to find out more about an adoption case from several years ago. The case involved a young girl named Ellie. He chose his words carefully, watching her reaction. Her expression faltered, and her eyes flicked to the side, as though calculating her next move. "I don't know any Ellie," she said, though her tone betrayed a hint of defensiveness. Alexander held her gaze, refusing to back down. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want answers. I lost my daughter years ago, and I believe she was taken from me under suspicious circumstances. All I need is the truth." Maria shifted, her eyes darting back to him with a flash of recognition. "It was a complicated case," she said slowly, lowering her voice. "The girl, she wasn't meant to stay where she was. There were people involved who had a vested interest in keeping her away from certain families." Alexander felt a surge of anger. "So you knew? You knew she had family, and you kept her from them?" She held up a hand, her expression cold. "You have no idea the kinds of people I was dealing with. I may not have agreed with it, but it was safer for everyone involved. I was just a middleman. They told me to make her disappear, and I made sure she did." He clenched his fists, his voice low and filled with barely restrained fury. "And who exactly were they? Who would go so far as to erase a child's entire history?" Maria's gaze turned distant, her voice bitter. "There were people who believed she'd be better off with someone who could keep her under the radar. Your family wasn't exactly low profile, Mr. Wade. Certain, influential people thought a quiet life would suit her better." Alexander felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knew what she was implying, that his own career, his high-profile status as an attorney, had somehow painted a target on his daughter. "But she's my child," he said, his voice breaking. "You took her from me. For what? Convenience? To make someone's life easier?" Maria looked away, her face unreadable. "Sometimes, the things we do to protect children are the hardest to live with," she said, her voice soft. "But you have her now, don't you? She's alive. She's safe. And that's more than some can say." "Who were they, Maria?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, pleading. "Who made this decision?" But Maria shook her head, her expression closed off. "I can't say any more, Mr. Wade. It would be best if you accepted that she's safe now. Let her have her life." With that, she shut the door, leaving Alexander standing in the darkened hallway, her words echoing in his mind. The fury, the helplessness, all tangled together until he could hardly breathe. He wanted to shout, to scream, but he forced himself to turn, his footsteps heavy as he left. The drive back was silent, his mind replaying her words over and over. Certain influential people, a quiet life. Those phrases struck him like a hammer, hints of something sinister, something that went deeper than he could have ever imagined. Someone with power had orchestrated Ellie's disappearance, had decided that she would be better off without her own family. When he returned home, the house was quiet, the lights dimmed. He found Ellie asleep in her room, curled up with the silver locket clutched in her hand. He watched her, the small rise and fall of her breath, the soft murmur as she dreamed. He realized then just how much he'd nearly lost, how easily she could have slipped through his grasp forever. He closed the door quietly, retreating to his own room, but sleep wouldn't come. The past he'd uncovered lay heavy on his chest, filling him with a cold determination. Whoever had stolen his daughter, whoever had tampered with her life, had to answer for it. The thought of leaving things unfinished, of not knowing who had manipulated his family's life, was unbearable. The next morning, he spoke with Ellie's mother, sharing as much of what he'd learned as he could bear. She listened quietly, her face pale, her hand gripping his as he explained. When he finished, she looked at him, her eyes filled with a fierce resolve. "What do we do now, Alexander?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil he could see swirling in her gaze. The following morning, Alexander stood at his office window, watching the city unfold beneath him. His hands were clasped behind his back, his mind buzzing with the investigator's words. A network, high-profile adoptions. The phrases lingered, unsettling in their implications, and for the first time in years, he felt a gnawing fear. Not for himself, but for Ellie. He turned when his phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a name he hadn't expected to see. Maria. The woman who had been evasive, who had shut the door in his face, was calling him. He took a deep breath and answered. "Mr. Wade." Her voice crackled through the phone, tense, as if she'd been weighing whether to make this call. "There's something you need to know, but not over the phone. Can you meet me at St. Jerome's Church? The one near 57th Street. He frowned, his instincts flaring with caution. "Why now, Maria? Last time we spoke, you didn't seem too willing to share." There was a pause, a faint, shaky breath on the other end. "Things have changed. I don't have time to explain, but trust me, if you want to know the truth about your daughter, you'll be there." 1 o'clock. The line went dead, leaving him with only the silence of his office. He stared at the phone, 1,000 questions swirling through his mind. Why would she contact him now? What could have possibly changed? But he knew he couldn't ignore it. This might be the last chance to uncover the truth, no matter the risk. At precisely 1 o'clock, Alexander stepped through the doors of St. Jerome's, his eyes adjusting to the dim, quiet interior. The pews were empty, and the air was filled with the faint scent of candle wax and dust. Maria sat near the back, her posture tense, her eyes flicking toward the door every few seconds. She seemed older, wearier than he remembered, as if the weight of years had finally caught up with her. He approached her slowly, sliding into the pew beside her. She glanced at him, her eyes sharp but filled with something he hadn't seen before. Fear. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't have long, so listen carefully." "I'm listening," Alexander replied, keeping his tone steady, though his heart was racing. She took a shaky breath, her fingers trembling as she twisted them together. When Ellie's case came to the agency, there were already people watching it. Influential people who didn't want her traced back to her family. They wanted her lost in the system. My job? I was supposed to make sure she disappeared, that no one would come looking. Alexander's jaw clenched, fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. Why? Who would go to such lengths to keep a child from her family? She hesitated, her gaze darting to the stained glass windows, her voice dropping lower. It's not about Ellie alone. There are others. Children from families with money, connections. They disappear because it's profitable, because someone's willing to pay to ensure they're kept hidden. It's a trade that goes on under everyone's noses, shielded by the very people meant to protect them. He felt a wave of nausea, the reality of her words crashing over him like a tidal wave. Are you saying there's an entire operation to separate children from their families? For money? Yes, she said, her voice laced with regret. And they're protected. Lawyers, judges, social workers. All paid off to make it look legitimate, to bury records. By the time you realize what's happened, they're already gone, sealed away in the system, handed over to new families. Alexander took a deep breath, steadying himself. And Ellie? How did she end up in their hands? Maria looked away, her expression crumpling with guilt. I didn't know who she really was until it was too late. They told me her family had abandoned her, that she needed a clean break. By the time I found out, the paperwork was already processed. And once she was gone, there was nothing I could do. He clenched his fists, a dark rage boiling within him. So, you helped them tear my daughter from her family. You let her slip into the hands of strangers for a paycheck. Maria's face fell, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his accusation. I didn't know, she murmured. At least not at first. But when I finally realized, it was too late. I couldn't get her back. And if I tried, they would have destroyed me. For a moment, Alexander said nothing, his heart pounding with a mixture of fury and grief. He wanted to lash out, to make her understand the depth of the pain she had caused. But he forced himself to stay calm, focusing on the one thing that mattered now. Who are they, Maria? He asked, his voice cold. Give me their names. She swallowed, her gaze shifting to the side, as if even speaking their names would bring them closer. They don't like their business being interrupted. But there's one name that might help you, a man named Carl Dempsey. He's a judge with a lot of power, and he's one of the ringleaders. He's the one who makes the cases disappear, who decides where the children go. Carl Dempsey, Alexander repeated, committing the name to memory. And where can I find him? Maria shook her head, her face etched with fear. That's all I can tell you. I've said too much already. If they find out I spoke to you. She trailed off, her expression haunted, as if she were already imagining the consequences. Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. Thank you, he said quietly. You did the right thing. She nodded, a faint glimmer of relief flickering across her face. Without another word, she stood and slipped out of the church, disappearing into the cold afternoon, leaving Alexander alone with the enormity of what he'd learned. That night, he returned home, his mind racing with the implications of Maria's confession. Carl Dempsey, a judge. The very thought made his blood boil. He had crossed paths with men like Dempsey before, people who believed they were untouchable, shielded by their power and influence. But this time, it was different. This time, it was personal. As he entered the house, he found Ellie waiting for him in the hallway, her face brightening when she saw him. She ran up to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist, and he held her tightly, his heart aching with the knowledge of what had been stolen from them. "Where were you, Mr. Wade?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Just working on something important, sweetheart. Something to keep you safe." Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, but she nodded, trusting him without question. He knew he couldn't tell her everything, not yet, but one day, he would make sure she understood the truth, that he had fought for her, that he'd done everything in his power to bring her home. That night, after Ellie went to bed, Alexander sat in his study, a determined resolve settling over him. He knew his next step would be to confront Carl Dempsey, to demand answers. But he also knew he had to be careful. Dempsey was protected, a man who wielded influence with a subtle cruelty that had likely ruined countless lives. One wrong move, and he could lose everything he'd worked for. But as he stared at the city lights from his window, he felt a renewed strength. He wasn't the broken man he'd been years ago, the man who had let grief and loss consume him. He was a father, a protector, and he would stop at nothing to bring Ellie the justice she deserved. He began to devise a plan, calling on allies he knew he could trust, preparing himself for the inevitable confrontation. Dempsey would be difficult to reach, but Alexander had spent his career taking down men who thought they were untouchable. He would find a way. The following weeks were a relentless pursuit. Alexander worked late into the night, pulling every string, calling in every favor, and reviewing every case file tied to Carl Dempsey's courtroom. Dempsey was careful, hiding his tracks, but Alexander knew that if he dug deep enough, he'd find something, anything, that would reveal the judge's involvement in Ellie's disappearance and others like her. The stakes had never been higher. He wasn't just fighting for Ellie's past, but for her future and the future of countless children lost in a corrupt system. One evening, after days of silence, Alexander received a message from an old investigator friend. It was a simple text with an address, followed by one line. "You didn't get this from me." Alexander felt a surge of adrenaline, knowing it could be his one shot at confronting Dempsey directly. The address led him to a private country club on the outskirts of the city, a place where deals were made behind closed doors, far from the eyes of the public. It was the kind of place Dempsey frequented, a sanctuary for the powerful, where they were safe from scrutiny. Alexander parked outside and waited, watching as Dempsey's black sedan pulled up. The judge stepped out, his frame imposing, his expression calm, unbothered. Alexander's fists clenched as he watched the man stroll toward the entrance, unaware that his past was closing in on him. When the judge was inside, Alexander slipped past the guards, weaving through the halls until he found Dempsey in a private lounge. The room was dim, filled with the scent of cigar smoke and leather, with Dempsey seated in a high-backed chair, nursing a glass of whiskey. Dempsey looked up as Alexander approached, surprise flickering across his face before he masked it with a polite smile. "Mr. Wade," he said smoothly, his voice as calm as ever. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Alexander held his ground, his eyes fixed on the man who had, in all likelihood, stolen his daughter. "I think you know exactly why I'm here, Judge." Dempsey's smile faltered, and his eyes narrowed. "If this is about that unfortunate adoption matter, I assure you, everything was handled legally. You'd be wise to remember that. Legally? Alexander spat, his voice low but seething with anger. You call trafficking children through the system legal? You stole my daughter. You manipulated records, erased her identity, and made sure she'd never be found. Dempsey's face turned cold, his smile fading into a smirk. Mr. Wade, I'm sure a man of your stature understands how the world works. Some things are simply unavoidable. Ellie was just one case among many. I gave her a new life, one she would never have had with you. Alexander took a step closer, his fists clenched. You're going to pay for what you did. For every child you tore from their family, for every parent you left in the dark. Dempsey's eyes flashed with disdain, and he leaned back, a self-assured smile on his face. You think you can take me down? Men like me don't fall, Wade. You can try, but you'll only find yourself dragged down in the process. Alexander felt a chill, but it only fueled his determination. I don't care what it takes. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. I'll destroy your legacy, piece by piece. For a long moment, they stared each other down, the weight of their shared history thick in the air. Then, without another word, Alexander turned and walked out, feeling the full weight of what he'd just started. The next few days, he worked furiously, filing a formal investigation with the state attorney's office, gathering testimony from families who'd been victims of the same network. He enlisted his contacts in the media, journalists who had spent years investigating corruption in the foster care system. Within days, a series of exposés hit the headlines, detailing a network of illegal adoptions linked to influential figures, including Judge Carl Dempsey. The public outcry was immediate. Dempsey's name was plastered across every news channel, every front page. Parents came forward, sharing stories eerily similar to Alexander's, each one more devastating than the last. Dempsey's power was crumbling, his allies scattering as his crimes were laid bare. But Dempsey didn't go down without a fight. One evening, Alexander returned home late to find his townhouse door ajar, a thin sliver of light seeping through the crack. His heart raced as he quietly entered, the sound of footsteps echoing faintly from upstairs. He moved cautiously, reaching for the small, concealed pistol he kept in a drawer by the door. He crept up the stairs, every sense heightened, his mind flashing through scenarios. At the top of the stairs, he saw a figure standing in the hall, looking through Ellie's bedroom door. It was Dempsey, his face twisted with anger. "Dempsey," Alexander called out, his voice steady but filled with a cold fury. Dempsey turned, startled, but he quickly recovered, his face twisting into a sneer. "You just don't know when to give up, do you, Wade?" "Get out of my house," Alexander said, his voice dangerously low. Dempsey took a step forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You have no idea what you've started. You think you can ruin me? I'll take her back, Wade. Ellie is just as much mine as she is yours." Alexander raised the pistol, his hand steady as he aimed it directly at Dempsey. "Take another step, and I swear I'll pull the trigger." Dempsey froze, his face twisting with fury as he realized Alexander wasn't bluffing. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice seething. "You may have won this round, but men like me don't fall so easily." Without another word, he turned and left, disappearing into the night, leaving Alexander standing in the dimly lit hallway, his heart pounding as the reality of what had just happened settled over him. In the days that followed, the investigation intensified. Dempsey was arrested on charges of corruption, child trafficking, and abuse of power, his reputation shattered beyond repair. Alexander felt a sense of closure, a finality that had eluded him for so long. The shadow over his family had lifted, and Ellie was safe. She was his, and nothing would take her away again. One evening, as he sat with Ellie in the living room, watching her as she pored over a book, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. She looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled. "Mr. Wade." "Dad," she corrected herself, the words still new and precious. Are we really going to be okay now?" He smiled, reaching over to gently squeeze her hand. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to be just fine. No one's going to hurt us again." They sat together, the quiet warmth of the room enveloping them. Alexander knew there were still challenges ahead, Memories that might linger, but for the first time, he felt truly free. He had Ellie by his side, and together, they would build a life filled with love and the promise of a future untouched by the shadows of the past. And as he watched her, her face relaxed and hopeful, he knew that in the end, he had finally brought his daughter home.